Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My life is a profession of invisibility. I am a ghost, a silent partner in the success of other people. My name is Elias, and for the better part of 2 decades, I have been a speechwriter. It is a strange and solitary craft. I am an architect of a voice that is not my own. I build narratives for men and women of power, for CEOs, for politicians, for the kind of people who move the world but who lack the specific and often inconvenient gift of being able to articulate why. My work is to inhabit them, to crawl inside their minds, to understand their ambitions, their fears, their vanities, and to weave those raw, chaotic threads into a coherent, powerful, and persuasive tapestry of words. I am a ventriloquist, and the entire world is my stage, but no one ever sees my lips move. I have written the words that have launched billion-dollar companies, the words that have calmed panicked markets, the words that have defined the legacies of men and women far more important than myself. And my greatest, most complex, and most beloved project, the one work I consider to be my masterpiece, was my wife, Clara. When I met her, she was a brilliant, fiery, and deeply insecure junior executive with a mind like a steel trap and a public speaking ability that was, to put it kindly, a train wreck. She had the ideas. She had the ambition. She had the vision. But she did not have the words. And I, a man who was made of nothing but words, fell in love with her brilliant, chaotic, and beautifully inarticulate mind. Our marriage was, from the very beginning, a partnership of profound and deeply symbiotic intimacy. I did not just love her, I became her. My quiet, book-lined study became the laboratory where the public persona of Clara Quinn, the visionary CEO of the clean tech startup Helios Energy, was forged. My work for her was not a job, it was an act of devotion. I would spend hours listening to her, to the passionate, rambling, and often contradictory torrent of her ideas. I was her first and most important audience. And then I would retreat to my study and I would perform my quiet alchemy. I would take the raw, chaotic ore of her genius and I would smelt it, refine it, and forge it into the polished, powerful, and incredibly persuasive steel of her public voice. The keynote speeches that made her a star at tech conferences, the shareholder letters that calmed nervous investors, the powerful, visionary mission statements that attracted the brightest minds to her company, they were all born in the quiet, monastic silence of my small room, crafted by my own invisible hands. I was the ghost in her machine, the silent, unassuming engine that powered her brilliant, meteoric rise. I did not resent this. I reveled in it. Her success was my success. Her voice was my voice. I would sit in the back of a crowded auditorium, a quiet, unassuming man in a simple dark suit, and I would listen as she held thousands of people in the palm of her hand, speaking my words, my rhythms, my carefully crafted metaphors. And I would feel a sense of pride so profound, so complete, that it was a physical and deeply satisfying ache in my chest. We were a perfect two-person system. Our life was the work, and the work was our life. Our home, a beautiful minimalist house that she had designed and that my anonymous lucrative career had paid for, was our sanctuary. It was the quiet, controlled environment where the messy, collaborative, and deeply intimate work of creating Clara Quinn was done. And for 10 years, it was a beautiful and deeply successful collaboration. The shift, the first subtle and almost imperceptible change in the atmospheric pressure of our life, began with the arrival of Julian. Julian Croft was the new COO of Helios, a charismatic, silver-haired, and ruthlessly efficient executive she had poached from a rival company. He was, by all accounts, a genius of operations, a man who could take her grand, visionary ideas and translate them into the hard, practical, and profitable language of the market. He was, she told me, the final, missing piece of her puzzle. "He gets it, Elias," she would say, her eyes shining with a new and unfamiliar kind of light. "He doesn't just hear what I'm saying, he understands the music behind the words." The music behind the words. The phrase was a small, sharp, and strangely cold object in my heart. I was the one who wrote the music. I was the composer. Julian, it seemed, was the new and apparently more appreciative audience. He became a constant presence in our life, a third note in a harmony that had always been designed for two. There were late-night strategy sessions at our house, the three of us around the large oak dining table, the air thick with the scent of coffee and ambition. I liked him at first. He was intelligent, he was witty, and he was, most importantly, completely and utterly devoted to her vision. He looked at her with a kind of awe, a reverence that I, as her husband, understood completely. I saw him not as a rival, but as an ally, another true believer in the Church of Clara Quinn. My role in these sessions was a quiet one. I was the observer, the listener, the man who would absorb the raw, chaotic energy of their brainstorming and then, later, in the silence of my study, distill it into the pure, clean lines of her next great speech. But I began to notice a change in their dynamic. The professional admiration began to be tinged with something else, something more personal. The shared, triumphant glances that would linger a moment too long. The easy, casual way he would touch her arm to emphasize a point. The inside jokes, the shared references, the quiet, unspoken language that was beginning to develop between them. A language from which I, the master of language, was quietly and completely excluded. I told myself it was nothing. It was the natural intimacy of two brilliant minds working in close, high-stakes collaboration. I was a man who lived in a world of quiet contemplation. I did not understand the adrenaline-fueled foxhole camaraderie of the corporate battlefield. I was being insecure. I was being small. So I pushed the doubts down. I continued to do my work. I continued to be the quiet, invisible architect of her voice. I continued to build the beautiful, solid, and dependable foundation of our life, ignoring the hairline fractures that were beginning to appear in the walls. The first, undeniable piece of evidence that the fracture was not in my mind, but in the world itself, was a small and seemingly insignificant thing. It was a file, a draft of an email which I had found in the shared cloud-based folder where we kept all of our work in progress. I had been looking for my notes for her upcoming keynote speech at a major climate summit, but I had clicked on the wrong file. The email was not a business communication. It was a personal one. It was a love letter. A beautiful, passionate, and deeply, profoundly, and devastatingly intimate love letter. And it was from her, to him, to Julian. I stared at the words on the screen, my blood turning to a slow, cold, and viscous sludge in my veins. The letter was a confession, a declaration, a celebration of their secret and apparently long-standing love. It spoke of stolen moments, of shared secrets, of a future they were planning, a future that was a world away from the quiet domestic life she shared with me. It was a work of art. It was a masterpiece of emotional and deeply romantic prose. And the most terrible, the most soul-crushing, the most absolutely, unforgivably, and exquisitely cruel part of it all was that I recognized the words. I recognized the rhythm. I recognized the specific and deeply personal metaphors. I recognized the music, because it was my music. The letter was written in the voice that I, and I alone, had created for her. She had taken the language of our intimacy, the secret, beautiful, and sacred language I had crafted for her, for us, and she had used it to woo another man. She had not just given him her heart, she had given him my words. She had given him my soul. I sat in the silent, sterile glow of my computer screen, in the heart of my sanctuary, and I felt the entire, beautiful and meticulously crafted world I had built for her, for us, begin to dissolve into a meaningless and deeply, profoundly and irrevocably fraudulent string of empty and stolen words. The ghostwriter had just discovered that his own entire life was a work of ghost-written fiction. And the author, the brilliant, cruel, and completely unknown author, was my own wife. The discovery of the letter was not a singular event. It was a detonation. A quiet, internal, and utterly devastating explosion that sent shrapnel into every corner of my memory, shredding the entire beautiful tapestry of our shared history. I was a man adrift in the wreckage of his own personal museum, where every artifact, every cherished memory, was now revealed to be a forgery. I did not confront her. To do so would have been to engage with the lie on her terms, to enter into a messy, emotional, and ultimately meaningless negotiation with a ghost. My rage, my pain, my sense of profound and absolute betrayal was a cold, quiet, and deeply private thing. It was a specimen, a rare and terrible new species of sorrow. And I needed to study it, to understand it, in the sterile, controlled environment of my own silent laboratory. My study, which had once been the birthplace of her voice, now became the morgue where I would perform the autopsy of our marriage. The question was no longer if she had betrayed me, but how. I needed to understand the scope, the timeline, the full, intricate, and devastating architecture of her deception. I became a different kind of writer. I was no longer a speechwriter. I was a biographer of a lie. I was a detective, and my sole suspect was the woman who slept in my bed, who kissed me in the morning, and who was, I now knew, living a life of such profound and breathtaking duplicity that it was a work of art in itself. My investigation was a quiet, nocturnal, and deeply forensic affair. I used my skills as a researcher, my ability to sift through vast amounts of information and to find the single, salient, and often hidden data point. I started with our shared digital life, the vast, cloud-based archive of our last 10 years. But I looked at it now with new, cold, and terribly clear eyes. I was no longer seeing memories. I was seeing evidence. I created a timeline, a meticulous, cross-referenced, and utterly damning chronology of her affair. I used her calendars, her travel itineraries, the metadata from her photographs, the expense reports she filed with her company. And a clear and horrifying pattern began to emerge. The affair with Julian had not been a recent development. It had been going on for years, almost since the day he had joined the company. Her late nights at the office, her emergency weekend strategy sessions, her business trips to conferences I had not been invited to, they were all lies. They were the building blocks of her secret life, a life she had been living in parallel to her life with me. The most painful part of the investigation was the realization of my own unwitting complicity. I was not just the victim of her lie, I was its primary enabler. My quiet, supportive, and unquestioning nature had not been the foundation of her success. It had been the perfect and most necessary ingredient in her deception. I was the perfect cover, the steady, reliable, and deeply boring husband, a man so consumed by his own quiet world of words that he would never think to question the increasingly complex and brilliant fiction she was weaving around him. My greatest act of love, my gift to her of her own powerful voice, had been my greatest act of folly. I had not just given her the words to conquer the world, I had given her the words to deceive me, to build a new world with another man, a world from which I was, by design, completely and utterly excluded. The deepest and most unforgivable layer of the betrayal was not the emotional or the physical. I began to go back through the archives of my own work for her, the speeches, the articles, the mission statements, and I cross-referenced them with the public record of Helios Energy's success and of Julian Croft's own burgeoning reputation as a visionary corporate leader. And I saw it. My ideas, my strategies, my quiet, late-night musings on the future of green technology, the things I had shared only with her, in the supposed sacred intimacy of our marriage, they had not just been used in her speeches. They had been repackaged, rebranded, and presented to the world as the brilliant, strategic insights of Julian Croft. He was not just her lover, he was her mouthpiece. And I was the ghost writer for the ghost writer. I had been the silent, uncredited, and completely unpaid intellectual engine of both of their careers. The two of them, the brilliant CEO and her visionary COO, were a fraud, a beautiful, successful, and publicly celebrated fraud. And I was the one who had written their entire glittering and deeply dishonest story. The rage I felt was a clean, pure, and incredibly powerful thing now. It was the rage of an artist who has seen his masterpiece stolen, defaced, and signed with another man's name. But it was still a quiet rage, a cold rage. The rage of a man who does not scream, but who plans. I knew that a simple confrontation, a simple divorce, was not enough. To simply leave would be to allow their lie to continue, to allow them to build their empire on the foundations of my stolen work, my stolen life. My response had to be as quiet, as methodical, and as intellectually precise as the crime they had committed against me. I would not attack them with the clumsy, brutal weapons of the law. I would attack them with the only weapon I had ever truly mastered: the word. My plan, when it formed, was a simple and in its own way a deeply poetic one. I would not expose them. I would not destroy them. I would simply correct the attribution. The annual Innovators Gala was the most prestigious event in the tech industry, a glittering black tie affair where the titans of the industry gathered to celebrate their own brilliant successes. This year, the keynote speaker, the guest of honor, the man who was to be crowned as the visionary of the year, was Julian Croft. He was to speak about the Helios philosophy, about the bold new strategies that had made their company the darling of the industry. I knew with an absolute and chilling certainty that the words he would be speaking would be my words, that the philosophy he would be articulating would be my philosophy, that the vision he would be presenting would be my vision. The speech, I knew, would be a masterpiece, because I was going to write it. I began to work on the speech immediately. It was the most important and the most difficult piece I had ever written. I did not write it for him. I did not write it for her. I wrote it for me. It was a culmination of all my best ideas, a symphony of my most powerful and most personal metaphors. It was a beautiful and deeply honest articulation of the philosophy that had been the secret driving force of my entire anonymous career. And woven into its fabric, hidden in plain sight, was a series of quiet, subtle, and utterly undeniable personal signatures. A specific, unusual turn of phrase I had used in a love letter to Clara 10 years ago. A reference to a small, obscure philosophical text that only she would know I had been obsessed with. A structural rhythm, a cadence that was as unique and as identifiable as my own fingerprint. The speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric. And it was also, to the one person in the audience who truly mattered, a confession. My confession. A quiet, elegant, and deeply personal declaration that I, the ghost, was the true author of her entire world. The delivery mechanism for the speech was the final and most crucial part of the plan. I knew that she would be the one to give him the final draft. So I did not write one speech, I wrote two. The first speech was the one I would give to her. It was a good speech, a solid, professional, and completely soulless piece of corporate rhetoric. It was competent, it was forgettable. It was the kind of speech a hired professional speechwriter would produce. The second speech, my masterpiece, my confession, my quiet and devastating final statement, I saved on a small, encrypted USB drive. On the day before the gala, I knew that she and Julian would be having one of their final strategy sessions at his apartment. While they were there, I performed a small and deeply satisfying act of my own quiet corporate espionage. I let myself into her office at Helios. I went to her computer, and I swapped the files. I replaced the competent, boring speech on her hard drive with the real one. The one that was a testament to my love, my work, and my profound and now, finally, weaponized heartbreak. The trap was set.
The speech was loaded, and the entire glittering world of their industry was about to become the unwitting audience for the quiet and brutally elegant deconstruction of a lie. The day of the Innovators Gala was a study in surreal and deeply controlled calm. I was a man preparing for his own quiet and very public execution. Or perhaps it was a resurrection. I was not yet sure which. I spent the day in my study, my sanctuary, my laboratory. I did not work on the speech. The speech was done. It was a perfect, self-contained, and now fully armed explosive device waiting for its detonation. Instead, I spent the day reading. I read Marcus Aurelius. I read the Stoics. I was a soldier, preparing my mind for the battle to come. I was reinforcing the walls of my own internal fortress, a fortress that I knew was about to come under a profound and very public assault. My role for the evening was a familiar one. I was to be the quiet, supportive, and largely invisible husband, the plus one, the handsome, if somewhat bland, accessory on the arm of the brilliant and beautiful Clara Quinn. It was a role I had played 100 times. But tonight, I was not just an actor. I was the playwright, the director, and the secret and most important member of the audience. The preparations for the evening were a slow, deliberate, and deeply symbolic ritual. I chose my suit with care. It was not a new suit. It was the suit I had worn on our wedding day. A simple, classic, and beautifully made dark gray suit. A suit that was a testament to a time when I had believed in things that were built to last. It was a quiet, sartorial statement, a ghost from a past that was about to be very publicly and very messily re-examined. Clara was a vision of triumphant and utterly oblivious beauty. She wore a stunning, architectural, and breathtakingly expensive red dress, the color of victory, the color of blood. She was a queen on the night of her coronation, and she had no idea that her kingdom was about to be quietly and irrevocably dethroned. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, as we stood in the grand marble-floored lobby of our apartment building waiting for the car she had sent for. Her eyes were shining with a triumphant, proprietary light. "It's going to be Julian's night, our night." "I'm ready," I said, my voice a quiet and, in my own ears, a strangely calm and deeply resonant sound. The car ride to the gala was a journey into the heart of their world. The city glittered around us, a cold, beautiful, and completely indifferent constellation of lights. She was on her phone the entire time, a low, urgent murmur of last-minute logistics and whispered congratulations. I just sat in the silence, on my side of the plush leather seat, and I watched her. I was no longer seeing my wife. I was seeing a subject, a complex, brilliant, and deeply flawed character, whose final, tragic act I had just finished writing. The venue was a massive, cathedral-like space, a converted industrial building that had been transformed into a temple of modern, corporate power. The room was filled with 1,000 of the most powerful, most ambitious, and most celebrated people in the tech world. It was a room that was thick with the scent of money, of success, of a collective and deeply unshakable belief in its own brilliant mythology. We were greeted at the door by Julian. He was in his element, a charismatic, confident, and deeply tanned god in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He kissed Clara, a public, proprietary, and deeply, for me, illuminating gesture. He shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes already looking past me, scanning the room for a more important, more valuable connection. To him, I was not a rival. I was not even a person. I was a piece of the scenery, a background character in the brilliant, sweeping epic of his own life. "Elias," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced, and utterly dismissive sound. "Good of you to come." We moved through the room, a small solar system of our own. Clara and Julian were the twin suns, and I a small, quiet, and largely unnoticed moon, caught in their powerful gravitational pull. I listened to their conversations. I watched them work the room. They were a perfect team, a power couple in every sense of the word. And I, the man who had provided the very language of their power, was a silent and completely invisible ghost. The dinner was a long, loud, and deeply isolating experience. I sat at the head table, next to Clara, a place of honor that felt like a beautifully appointed prison cell. I ate the exquisite and completely tasteless food. I listened to the speeches, the endless self-congratulatory paeans to the genius of the tech industry. And I waited.
As the time for Julian's keynote address approached, a new and unfamiliar kind of calm settled over me. It was not the calm of a man who is at peace. It was the calm of a man who has already accepted the inevitable, catastrophic outcome. It was the calm of a bomb technician who has just cut the final wire and who is now simply waiting to see if the world will or will not explode. A small, panicked-looking assistant came to the table and whispered something in Julian's ear. He frowned. "My final slides," he said to Clara, his voice a low, annoyed growl. "They're in the wrong format. The AV guys are idiots." Clara looked at him, her face a mask of calm, supportive competence. "Don't worry," she said. "I have the original file on my drive. I'll go give it to them." She turned to me. "Elias, darling," she said, her voice a sweet and deeply ironic sound. "Would you be a dear and come with me? I might need a hand with the technical stuff." It was the perfect, final, and most beautiful of ironies. She was asking me, the ghost, the man she had made invisible, to be her accomplice in the final, technical preparations for her own, public, and very messy execution. "Of course, my love," I said, my voice a sweet and deeply ironic sound. "Would you be a dear and come with me? I might need a hand with the technical stuff." It was the perfect, final, and most beautiful of ironies. She was asking me, the ghost, the man she had made invisible, to be her accomplice in the final, technical preparations for her own, public, and very messy execution. "Of course, my love," I said, my voice a quiet, steady, and utterly truthful sound. I followed her, out of the bright, loud ballroom, and into the quiet, dim, and functional backstage area, the green room, the place where the performers wait before they step out into the light. She went to the AV desk, a chaotic mess of wires and screens. She took out her small, encrypted USB drive, the drive that I knew contained my speech, my testament, my quiet and devastating final word. And she handed it to the young, stressed-out technician. "Here," she said, "this is the master file. Just load this one. It's perfect." And it was. It was perfect. A perfect, beautiful, and utterly lethal piece of work. As she turned, her work done, a triumphant, relieved smile on her face, she saw me, standing in the shadows. And she did something that was, I think, a genuine and deeply human impulse. She reached for me. Her hand came out, a gesture of partnership, of shared victory, a desire to include me, the quiet, supportive husband, in her moment of triumph. It was the gesture of a woman who was about to step out onto the stage and who wanted her silent and most important crew member by her side. Her hand, her beautiful, familiar, and now completely alien hand, reached for mine. And I did not take it. I simply looked her in the eyes. And I let her see for the first time not the quiet, supportive, and endlessly forgiving husband, but the ghost, the writer, the man who knew the ending of the story. And I said the words, the quiet, simple, and utterly, irrevocably, and devastatingly final words. Not after that. The two words, not after that, were not a shout. They were a surgical incision. They were a quiet, precise, and deeply, irrevocably, and devastatingly final cut. They severed the last, thin, and now completely fraudulent thread that had connected our two worlds. I watched the life drain from Clara's face. Her triumphant, brilliant smile did not just fade, it shattered like a beautiful and very expensive piece of glass. Her eyes, which had been shining with the light of her victory, were now two dark and suddenly very empty holes. The color left her skin, leaving a pale, waxy, and utterly shocked canvas. She was a woman who had just had the entire foundational text of her life revealed to be a forgery in the one single place she had believed herself to be completely and unassailably safe. Her hand, which had been reaching for me in a gesture of shared public triumph, froze in the air between us. It was a strange and deeply pathetic sculpture of a question that would never be answered. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? The ghost she had so carefully and so successfully managed for so long had just spoken, and his one short and quiet sentence had been a verdict, a judgment, and an execution all in one. And then, from the ballroom, we heard the sound of applause, and the voice of the MC, a loud, booming, and deeply ironic sound. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the man you've all been waiting for, the visionary, the innovator, the future of our industry. Please welcome to the stage the COO of Helios Energy, Julian Croft. It was the sound of a guillotine rushing down. It was the sound of a curtain rising on the final, terrible, and very public act of their play. She looked from my face to the stage and back again, a look of pure animalistic panic in her eyes. She was trapped. Her lover, her partner, the man for whom she had sacrificed everything, was about to walk out onto that stage and deliver a speech that she now knew was a time bomb. A speech that was a love letter from the man she had betrayed. A speech that was a quiet, elegant, and deeply personal declaration of war. I did not stay to watch the explosion. The demolition was not my concern anymore. My work was done. I had written the final, devastating, and deeply honest chapter. The epilogue was for them and them alone to endure. I simply turned, and I walked away. Not out into the ballroom, but out a side door, a service exit, a quiet, anonymous escape route for the ghosts and the help and the invisible people who make the glittering world of the front of house possible. I walked out into the cool, clean, and blessedly silent night air. I did not take a car. I just walked. I walked for hours through the sleeping, empty streets of the city. I was a man who had just performed a single, quiet, and profoundly life-altering act of self-reclamation. I had not taken her money. I had not destroyed her company. I had not exposed her to the world. I had done something far more subtle and far more powerful. I had taken back my voice. I had taken back my story. I had taken back my soul. The aftermath, as I learned later, from the quiet, gleeful whispers of the industry press, was a masterpiece of quiet corporate implosion. Julian Croft had delivered the speech, and it had been a triumph. The audience, who did not know the subtext, who did not understand the quiet, devastating music behind the words, had been mesmerized. He had received a standing ovation. He was the king of the world. But the one person whose opinion had mattered, the one person for whom the speech had been truly written, had understood. Clara, I was told, had simply dissolved. She had watched him, on that stage, speaking my words, my passion, my soul, and she had, in that moment, seen the full, terrible, and inescapable truth of her own profound and deeply, unforgivably, and utterly hollow self. Their partnership, which had been built on the foundation of my stolen genius, could not survive the revelation of its true author. The brilliant, fiery, and deeply symbiotic connection between them was gone, replaced by the cold, dead ash of suspicion and a shared and now undeniable guilt. Their company, Helios, did not fail overnight. It simply and slowly began to lose its magic. The visionary, brilliant, and seemingly unstoppable duo of Quinn and Croft had lost their harmony. The music, it turned out, was gone. They were just two ambitious and deeply flawed people who were now forced to rely on their own and, it turned out, not insignificant but ultimately uninspired voices. They were good, but they were no longer great. They were no longer the future. They were just another company. As for me, my life began again. I had walked out of that green room, and I had left the ghost of Elias Quinn, the speechwriter, behind. The man who walked out into the night was someone new. He was a writer, but he was a writer who now had his own voice. I went home to our house, to her house, to the beautiful, minimalist, and now completely and finally silent building. I packed a single, small bag. I took the one thing that had ever been truly mine, a small, worn, and deeply loved first edition of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I left her a note. It was not a note of anger. It was not a note of forgiveness. It was a simple and final act of professional courtesy, a final edit. "The story of us is over," I wrote. "I wish you well in the writing of your next chapter, but this time you will have to write it yourself." I did not file for a divorce. I didn't need to. Our marriage had not been a legal contract. It had been a creative partnership, and that partnership was, now and forever, dissolved. I moved to a small, quiet town by the sea, a place of wind and water and the slow, honest, and deeply reassuring rhythms of the natural world. And I began to write. Not speeches for other people, but a story of my own. A story about a quiet, unassuming man who had spent his life as a ghost and who had, in a single, quiet, and deeply, profoundly, and irrevocably, and finally, and truly, found his own voice. You've just heard a story from Reddit Whispers. Now I want to hear yours. What's the hardest truth you've ever had to face? Leave it below.